Boone Carlyle, played by Ian Somerhalder. Then, 27. Now, 47. Hugo Hurley Reyes, played by Jorge Garcia. Then, 32. Now, 53. Jack Shepherd, played by Matthew Fox. Then, 38. Now, 60. James Sawyer Ford, played by Josh Holloway. Then, 35. Now, 56. John Locke, played by Terry O'Quinn. Then, 52. Now, 74. Saeed Jarrah, played by Naveen Andrews. Then, 35. Now, 57. Jin Soo Kwon, played by Daniel Dae Kim. Then, 36. Now, 58. Sunhwa Kwon, played by Yoonjin Kim. Then, 31. Now, 52. Charlie Pace, played by Dominic Monaghan. Then, 27. Now, 49. Benjamin Linus, played by Michael Emerson. Then, 50. Now, 72. Desmond Hume, played by Henry Ian Cusick. Then, 38. Now, 59. Juliet Berg, played by Elizabeth Mitchell. Then, 36. Now, 56. Michael Dawson, played by Harold Perrineau. Then, 41. Now, 62. Claire Littleton, played by Emily DeRavin. Then, 22. Now, 44. Shannon Rutherford, played by Maggie Grace. Then, 21. Now, 42. Ana Lucia Cortez, played by Michelle Rodriguez. Then, 27. Now, 47. Man in Black, played by Titus Welliver. Then, 43. Now, 64. Richard Alpert, played by Nestor Carbonell. Then, 37. Now, 58. Charlotte Lewis, played by Rebecca Mader. Then, 29. Now, 49. Daniel Faraday, played by Jeremy Davies. Then, 37. Now, 57. Miles Strong, played by Ken Leung. Then, 38. Now, 56. Walt Lloyd, played by Malcolm David Kelly. Then, 12. Now, 34. Charles Widmore, played by Alan Dale. Then, 57. Now, 79. Penny Widmore, played by Sonia Walger. Then, 30. Now, 52. Jacob, played by Mark Pellegrino. Then, 40. Now, 61. Martin Keamy, played by Kevin Durand. Then, 32. Now, 52. Ethan Rom, played by William Mapother. Then, 39. Now, 61. Paulo, played by Rodrigo Santoro. Then, 29. Now, 50. Frank Lapidus, played by Jeff Fahey. Then, 53. Now, 73. Mr. Iko, played by Adewale Akinnude Agbaje. Then, 37. Now, 58. Libby Smith, played by Cynthia Watt-Rose. Then, 36. Now, 57. Alex Rousseau, played by Tanya Raymond. Then, 17. Now, 38. Danielle Rousseau, played by Mira Furlan. Then, 49. Passed away in 2021, at age 65. Nikki Fernandez, played by Kiele Sanchez. Then, 30. Now, 48. Ilana Verdansky, played by Zuleika Robinson. Then, 29. Now, 49. Rose Nadler, played by L. Scott Caldwell. Then, 54. Now, 76. Kate Austin, played by Evangeline Lilly. Then, 26. Now, 46. Bernard Nadler, played by Sam Anderson. Then, 58. Now, 79.